Episode 18, Attack on the Chemical Works, the continuing story of the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment in the Great War. After initial successful attacks of 9th of April 1917, capturing places such as Vimy Ridge, the battle was to grind on, ultimately leading to the highest daily casualty rate of the British Army during the whole war. Among those casualties was a familiar figure, Lieutenant Robin Monypenny. He described it as follows. The shelling by the Germans had now become very heavy, and on our last dash towards the redoubt, what felt like a thunderbolt struck me in the region of the heart, and I went down in agonizing pain. A piece of the shell from a high explosive had struck me in the chest. It was now getting dark, and there I lay, breathing in great gasps. I never lost consciousness. It would have been better for my agony of mind and body if I had. I thought, owing to the region of the wound and the awful agony, that I had had it this time, and I was mortally wounded and would be left there in the dark to die. I did not want to die. Life was sweet, especially just now, as I wanted so much to see my sweetheart again. I kept calling her name in a low moan. No one who has been full of the vitality of life one moment and struck down almost dying the next knows what the mental agony of it is. I lay there 3 hours. It seemed like 3 years. The attack here had failed, and our line had fallen back on the last of the Green Line. We had taken that afternoon, so I was now in no man's land. Unless men came out into it, I should not be found. However, I finally heard someone moving around. A pair of stretcher bearers were wandering around and looking for wounded. They bumped into me, picked me up, put me on their stretcher, and started off back. However, Robin wasn't too complimentary about his rescuers, returning to his account. Of course it was dark, and I suppose easy to stumble. I was surprised later, when I had had time to think about it, that they had been brave enough to come out into no man's land. Of course, they'd been ordered out to look for wounded, but probably had no idea where they were as far as proximity to the enemy was concerned. I was in terrible agony with every jolt. They kept tripping over wire, falling into shell holes, and every now and then, when a salvo of shells came near, they would drop me and run for cover. I thought in the dark they would fail to find me again, or even desert me. I cursed them heartily and grew desperate. I still had my revolver with me. I told them if they dropped me like that again, I would shoot them both. Also, unless they pulled themselves together and went more steadily and slowly instead of trying to hurry and trip over everything, I would place them under arrest and report it at the dressing station. This seemed to steady their nerves a bit, and after what seemed an eternity, I was taken down a deep dugout where a field dressing station had been established. Another officer casualty was the battalion's commanding officer, Lieutenant Col Sidney Mullock, who was killed by shell fire returning from an orders group. Now, Sidney Mullock had been educated at Haileybury College, and he was born in December 1881 in Newport, Monmouthshire, and was the son of William and Martha Moss. He married Margaret Maughan Bavin in 1909 in Blofeld, Norfolk, and they lived in Wales in 1911 on the census. Now, I don't know if it's coincidence about the name Bavin, but that was the name of a young officer in the battalion who unfortunately was killed in early 1915. Now, this picture here of Mullock is actually from when he was a captain, and he was at one point with the 13th Battalion of the Essex Regiment, the West Ham Regiment. He'd served in the South Africa War, and he entered France in 1914 and was badly wounded at the Battle of the Aisne and invalided home. He was captain and adjutant of the West Ham Battalion, as we've already mentioned, and he was then promoted to major and comes back to the 2nd Battalion. Here we see he was from Kelvedon Hatch, or linked to Kelvedon Hatch, and he's on the memorial there, and this is his grave in Hervin Farm. Now, among the limited reinforcements coming into the battalion was 2nd Lieutenant Frederick Goodyear. Now, we've just mentioned that Mullock went through Haileybury College as an education. Goodyear ultimately had been to Oxford. He'd studied there and been noted as an academic. However, he was interested in sports, and when he graduated from Oxford, he took to writing reports on cricket for a magazine called The Field. He also just lived off writing with essays and other writing, and in 1913 he was actually living in Paris for a few months whilst he wrote an autobiographical novel. He migrates across into journalism, but that doesn't work out so well. So he returns to the UK and ends up as a temporary assistant master at Charterhouse another one of the famous public schools. Now, he also said that he would be writing books to do with this whilst he was here, but none of these seemed to work out for him. And he then takes a job at Oxford University Press in Bombay, probably to get away from the book writing contract, being a master at Charterhouse, we don't know. However, the timing of it all worked in such a way that when he arrived in India, the fighting in Europe broke out very soon, and so he resigned from that post, sailed back to England, and got back in January 1915. Now, he joined up and he joined a regiment called Artist Rifles, which was quite famous for generating new officers. And he was with them, but it's noted in some writing about Frederick Goodyear that he didn't really take to military life and to the military discipline, and therefore wasn't going to get commissioned from the Artist Rifles. And ultimately, he ends up transferring to the Royal Engineers and joins their meteorological service, and does go to France in September 1915 as a corporal. Now, during his time there, he was very interested in flora and fauna, something that continued through his military service. And he ultimately is recommended for a commission, returns to the UK, does his commissioning course, is commissioned into the Essex Regiment, and he sets out in March 1917 back to France. And when he joins the battalion, he continues to write to his family. And again, things about wildlife and particularly about birds are there throughout all of his letters. And this is an excerpt from one of his letters home to his family. April the 20th, 1917. I must apologise for leaving you so long without a proper letter. We are back today in billets, decent farm buildings, all lovely. I was 8 days in trenches, but not the front line. We have had very few casualties in the Easter Monday stunt, but the colonel was killed during the week, the only officer who was. The regiment is lousy with souvenirs. Apparently they insisted on going around the dugouts looking for watches, while the Germans formed themselves into fours and marched away without escort. There was also one man who, having knocked a German down with the butt of his rifle, immediately went and got some water from a shell hole and revived him again. The acting commanding officer is only 24, and I've been transferred from Ward's company to D. I'm glad that I've got another decent company commander, and that he isn't too young. He's 44, in fact, and sort of an old Dally in style. The weather is beastly early in the week, and I was partially poisoned by some tinned curry. The padre of this battalion is from Cartmel, Taylor by name. When he had to cut down his kit to the regulation £35, he packed his gumboots with the hymn books. I told him I thought it was the most interesting case of ecclesiastical fraud that I've ever come across. I should very much like a copy of James Joyce's Dubliners. Ends the letter. The commanding officer that Frederick Goodyear mentioned there was Noel Irwin, who we've met often in our narrative. And this is how Noel Irwin describes the following events. After a short tour out of the line, the battalion returned to the front on the 30th of April, once again just to the north of the chemical works at Roeux. And we can see Roeux in the middle and the chemical works just above that. This attack was ordered for the 3rd of May, just before dawn. The short notice was quite insufficient to enable all troops involved to study the ground and plan, both so essential to a night attack. Neither had any opportunity been given to practice the attack beforehand in the back areas. In view of this unpreparedness, I protested to my brigade commander, Brigadier General Adrian Carton de Wert, VC, Victoria Cross, distinguished, gallant, and most wounded fighting soldier. He's been wounded 9 times in the other campaigns and had lost an eye and an arm. General de Wert passed on my protest to the divisional commander. The not unexpected reply was the effect that the Essex attack was only a small part of a greater operation on a wide front, and if Colonel Irwin did not wish to undertake it, no doubt a successor to him in command could easily be found. End of Irwin's excerpt. And this is a guy that you should look up, Carton de Wert, W-I-A-R-T. An amazing story. And if you look at what is his left sleeve, the right side, as we look at it, you might see those vertical lines, and they are wound stripes. So we can see how many times he was wounded there. The next bit of information comes from the regimental history, which we've used quite a lot in these episodes. May Day 1917 found the 2nd Battalion once again near to the Roeux chemical work on the Arras front, with heavy artillery active on both sides. There was a great deal of sniping, which caused severe casualties, 7 being killed and 18 wounded. Preparations went visually forward on the next day for a strenuous attack, the men in outpost lines having been brought in on the 9th of April, the 30th, and May the 1st. The operation of May the 3rd, in which the 4th Division took part, was planned to aid an important movement by the French 2 days later against the Chemin d'Armes. So Douglas Haig directed a considerable extension of his active front, which reached over 16 miles. The 4th Division had on its left the 9th Division, with the 17th Division in reserve. The former was expected to advance 2,500 yards, capture the northern part of the village of Roeux, including the chemical works and station buildings, and the trenches on the high ground nearby, finally piercing the partially wired defences round Plouvain. Not one of these operations in itself, wrote the division commander, presented insuperable problems if taken deliberately. In planning a combined operation, the great difficulty lay in arranging a creeping barrage to suit the conflicting interests of the two divisions. This barrage had again to be coordinated with that of the flank corps. Now, the northern part of Roeux was a formidable obstacle. The group of houses called the Chemical Works lay on either side of the Greville-Roeux road, the largest being the chateau, which had fixed stone walls and extensive cellars. East of the buildings were two large factories and a quarry, the latter being the site of two dugouts. Houses also lined the road to the cemetery and to Roeux. Behind the chateau, the Germans had constructed a strong point protected by a wall of concrete 7 foot thick and served by 4 machine guns, which swept all the country behind the chateau up to the railway on the north and the cemetery on the south. This portion of the village had been assaulted on previous occasions, but so far the British troops employed had not been able to hold it. Movement over the forward slope of the Pont du Jour, Fampoux Spur, or along the Scarpe Valley was in full view of the enemy on Windmill Hill, and the assembly trenches could not be occupied in daylight hours. The high ground, which constituted the second objective, sloped deeply to the Scarpe, so the ground behind the ridge was invisible. The difficulties to be overcome and taking the second and third lines were intensified by the railway line running diagonally across the line of advance of the 4th Division. The rails being carried for 700 yards east of the station on an embankment, which had machine gun emplacements thereof. Whilst beyond there was a deep cutting. Troops starting north of the railway line, therefore, had to remain north. The 4th Division had to conform to the movements of the 9th Division, which was north of the railway line. The instructions were that the portion of the division on the north of the railway should form a defensive flank facing south along the railway cutting, until the troops advancing south of the railway at a slow rate had got level with them. The bombardment of Roeux was not as effective as was hoped, and the fact this had considerable influence upon the subsequent operations. The losses sustained by the division in the taking of Fampoux had not been made good, and the total strength available was 228 officers and 5,059 other ranks, of which the 12th Brigade had 80 officers and 1,941 other ranks. However, carrying parties had to be provided. The casualties sustained upon this occasion, May the 3rd, were very heavy, numbering 107 officers and 2,009 other ranks. The principal sufferer here was the 12th Brigade, with 54 officers and 1,094 other ranks becoming casualties. The Essex on the north, north of the railway line, with the 9th Division on the left flank. At 3:45 a.m., under a heavy barrage, the men pushed forward to secure the ground to the left of the chemical works. A Company was on the left and C Company on the right, with B in support and D in reserve. The two leading companies were assailed by desolating machine gun fire, which mowed them down in scores, and a like fate met B Company when it went gallantly forward to fill their places. The men made some progress in Cook and Crow trenches, and possibly went further in the smoke and darkness, but the confusion of conflict was increased by the right flank of the 9th Division coming across the front of the Essex. After vain endeavour for some time, it was realised at 5 a.m. that the attack upon this part of the line had failed. The enemy still holding the chemical works on the right, and the 9th Division being unable to make headway on the left. Lieutenant S.G. Showers, at this junction, organised the front line for resistance to a possible counter-attack, with 2 platoons of D Company and details of the 2nd Lancashire Fusiliers and the 1st King's Own, the 1st Rifle Brigade, being brought up in close support during the afternoon. At 10:30 a.m. and again at 2:20 p.m, the enemy counter-attacked from the area of Delbar and Hansard Woods and that's in the bottom right-hand square that you can see there, the red square. The latter made some ground, first sweeping past the north of Roeux, then east of the chateau, crossing the railway line near the station, reaching Crook and Crow trenches, and actually effecting their lodgment in Clover Trench until they were bombed out of it. As that's all happening in that top left-hand red box. The remainder of the first wave took cover in the trenches north of the railway and in the railway cutting, while the second succumbed to the artillery fire directed upon it. An attack was ordered at 11 p.m. with a view to extricating any men surviving at the chateau and beyond it. The 10th Brigade was able to establish a line of posts in advance of the original position from west of the cemetery to the River Scarpe, which post they were able to maintain. But the 1st Rifle Brigade, which was attacked to the 12th Brigade, did not make progress, and so, with the exception of the ground gained by the 10th Brigade and a portion of Crook and Czar trenches, at 10:30 p.m. the division was on its original line, having had 20 hours of continuous fighting under depressing conditions. The divisional commander ascribed the causes of the check to be 1. Inadequate preliminary bombardment, 2. Distance and number of objectives in view of the number of troops available, 3. Attempts to execute a night attack on a large scale without sufficient previous warning to enable the necessary precautions to be taken, 4. The pace of the barrage, which was calculated for a day operation and was too fast for a night operation, and 5. Failures of moppers up to carry out the task in the darkness. And if you look at that, the divisional commander's remarks are very similar to points raised by Noel Irwin before the attack. Speaking of Noel Irwin, let's return to his account. It was realised at 5 a.m. that the attack on this part of the line had failed. 14 officers and 200 men, out of a total of over 300, were killed. It was a very depressing start for Irwin, a young commander of 24, perhaps the youngest lieutenant colonel in France at the time. One of the reasons for the failure, the divisional commander reported, was the attempt to execute a night attack on a large scale without sufficient warning to enable the necessary preparation to be made, confirming Irwin's protest before the action began. Harold Moore, that we met in previous episodes, in his interview with the Imperial War Museum, he just talks about this attack. Now, he was actually left out of battle from A Company, quite a common process at this point in time to leave a number of officers and men out, so if the unit was really hammered, there was still a cadre there that you could rebuild it around, and he described it quite shortly as a fiasco. Among the many casualties, and this is a body density map showing the number of bodies found in these squares during battlefield clearance after the attacks, after the war, in fact, if I remember rightly. You can see there's a large number of casualties in and around this area. One of them was a man called Carey, I think it's A. Carey, and he's from a town in Essex called Rayleigh. He was actually born in a place called Fundersley, but he lived at Ivy Cottages, Dawes Heath Road. He enlisted in February 1915 and died of wounds that he sustained in this attack on the chemical works. The reason I mention him is that he was one of four brothers who served in the military, and as we can see from the memorial here, he was one of 3 brothers that died in the war. So 3 of the 4 brothers were killed during the First World War. The war diary states that during this period, 2 officers were killed, 5 were wounded, 96 other ranks were killed. Sorry, I've got that a little bit muddled, but essentially the casualties are quite heavy. But the Commonwealth War Graves Commission database shows that there were 84 people killed in this attack. One of them was Private Garrett. Now, he's the son of Mrs. Garrett of 2 Jury Street, Great Yarmouth, and the late John Garrett, and he was the husband of Mabel Gertrude Garrett of 58 Church Road, Great Yarmouth. Now, the battalion was reinforced by only 100 men and with a total of 5 officers. The battalion returned to the line on the 11th of May, and it had a secondary part in further attacks upon the Roeux chemical works, essentially trying to hold the frontline trenches whilst other units passed through and attacked. And here again, the casualties were heavy, and Irwin found himself one of only 2 or 3 officers who survived the fighting from the battalion. And he writes, "It is always with a sense of intense relief that a commanding officer reported his unit had completed its move into or out of the trenches. when only a few yards separated the opposing armies, when the moon was high and the ground was hard, the increased activities of one unit relieving another could scarcely be concealed. One was in a sweat of apprehension lest a barrage of fire should descend or an attack be launched during the confusion of relief. It was with impatience and anxiety, therefore, that Commander awaited arrival of the last orderly, with his commander's note that his company was securely installed in its trenches or safely withdrawn from the line. The changes of units after this second tour on the line opposite the chemical works was a nightmare. An unsuccessful attack had recently been launched through our position by another battalion, and the remnants withdrawn, leaving my weakened battalion in charge of a very confused situation. The night was black as pitch, and the arrival of the relieving unit so delayed that dawn might break, with the relief incomplete and arriving or departing troops caught in open, in full view of an alert enemy. Add to this the realization that neither officers nor specially selected guides were sufficiently familiar with the geography of their sector, or the disposal of their troops, when you have all the ingredients of a truly disturbing situation, and a night of worry and anxiety for the commanders. Patiently as possible, I sat in an insecure dugout, awaiting in turn the arrival of the relief complete reports from the various companies. One after the other, they came for 3 companies, each having added some depressing bit of news about casualties or misunderstandings or misadventures. Then followed a long and ever-lengthening gap without sign of news of the 4th and last company. The hours passed. No rearward movement of troops could be heard, or had been noted by sentries or headquarters personnel. Orderlies sent to the front line to investigate returned to say that evidently the relief was complete, as the new unit was in the trenches, and that the last company must have gone out safely, but for some inexplicable reason the report had not reached me. I then set off in search myself, because I felt sure something was wrong, not merely a case of forgetfulness by the company. The faint light of approaching dawn was beginning, and served to emphasize the urgency of my position, when an orderly of my headquarters stumbled on the body. It was the body of the commander of my 4th company, recognized in the dim light by a chain armor waistcoat he used to wear. So little had it availed him. He himself was the bearer of the news of the completion of his company relief, and travelling alone through the trenches had fallen silently to a chance bullet. A few yards away, we'd been waiting in rising anxiety for the news he had tried so hard to bring. Now, my research would suggest that this officer was actually Second Lieutenant George Frederick Barker. Now, he was the only son of the late Mr. Frederick J. Barker and Mrs. Kate Barker of Hazeldean, Rose Valley, Brentwood, and he was aged 33. He'd lived practically all his life in the Brentwood area, where he was well known. He was a fine sportsman and athlete. He'd played for Essex at football and was a fine all-rounder for Brentwood Cricket Club. He was a defender in the victorious South Weald FC side of 1909-1910, when they won the Essex Senior Cup, the most prestigious cup competition in the county of Essex. He'd represented both Brentwood and Essex cricket clubs and had been a long-term player. He was a school teacher before the war and was granted the commission in December 1914 and gazetted to the Essex Regiment. He went out to the Dardanelles and was invalided home with rheumatic fever, and for some time he was a physical instructor and director of bayonet training at a battalion at home. I think that was probably the 3rd Battalion, which was at Felixstowe, which is where the troops went through. During the time, he was promoted to lieutenant, and in March 1917 he rejoined his battalion and went to the front. In September 1915, he had married Miss Lydia Horwood of Double House, Aldborough Hatch, Ilford, and he is recorded on the memorial for the Ilford War Memorial. The steady rate of casualties, even whilst on defensive, continued. Frederick Goodyear was to write to his parents. May the 17th, 1917. It's rather hard for me to know exactly what letters I've had, as I've had a shock. Anyway, I never got the apples, and Wood never got his parcel, not the post office fault. Ward went over the top on an unlucky stunt the week before last, and after lying 3 days out, was shot by men of another unit trying to return. Only one officer of those sent over when we came back quite unhurt. Returning to myself, I was in reserve and support trenches from the date of the last letter you have in my hand. At 6:45 a.m. on May the 12th, a shell buried me in a dugout or shelter with my servant. I was soon found and dug out. My left leg was quite smashed below the knee. One way and another, I got here the same evening and the left foot was amputated. Monday morning, I had another operation as the face of the amputation was not clean. I believe that was the reason. I believe I may now proceed to the base quite soon. That's all right, a letter might reach me here. I don't think any parcel would. On the whole, it's probably best to hang on until I'm better and a bit stronger. This is practically the first time I've sat up at all. I should never get to sleep at night without my injection. My controversies with the nurses are faintly interesting. I got the Dubliners. And that's the end of his letter. Now, Frederick Goodyear died of his wounds on the 23rd of May 1915, aged 30. Now, we've already talked a bit about his education. His housemaster wrote about him. His striking appearance and incisive manner arrested attention. His interests were literary and artistic rather than academic. Essentially an eclectic, he found it difficult to concentrate on subjects that bored him. Frederick Goodyear was not a boy who readily followed the crowd. No housemaster could have had a more capable and loyal house captain. As the Battle of Arras came to an end, attention was about to shift to the north, back to Belgium, and back to Ypres for the Third Battle of Ypres. And that is where we'll pick it up in the next episode.